Here is a short recap of what we discussed about the light-dependent reactions. So we are talking about the structure of a chloroplast, first of all. And so this is our chloroplast over here on the left side of the diagram. And remember, the chloroplast is a double membrane-bound organelle, and it has inside of it these stacks of membranes. One of these flattened discs is called a thylakoid, and the entire stack of thylakoids has its own term, and that is called a granum, or grana would be the plural form. Now also we have this inner fluid called the stroma. So those are the parts of the chloroplast itself. The part that we're particularly interested in is this thylakoid, which is inside of the box here, and you can see it over in this side view blown up a little bit so that we can see the membrane and we can see some of the proteins that are embedded in the membrane. So inside of this membrane, let's go ahead and identify those proteins. We have these proteins here, which look like ovals in our diagram. These are called the photosystems. And there are two of them. Inside of the photosystems, and the reason why I've color-coded them green, would be molecules of chlorophyll. So each photosystem has chlorophyll inside of it. So this would be our chlorophyll. Now also embedded within this membrane, you can see that we have this rectangle, which is meant to represent proteins within the electron transport chain. So we call that the electron transport chain, or simply just the ETC. Now there are other membranes or proteins embedded in the membrane that are part of that electron transport chain. You don't need to know all the specific components of this system. If you just know it as the electron transport chain, or ETC, that is sufficient for our purposes. And then we also have here at the bottom of the thylakoid a familiar structure. This is a structure that we previously learned about in cellular energetics. And this structure is called ATP synthase, which the name tells you is going to be an enzyme that synthesizes ATP. So all of those are the components of the light-dependent reactions. So what we are going to discuss is what actually happens when the light hits the chloroplast, and specifically the thylakoid within a chloroplast. So this is light dependent. So we are going to depend on the input of light here. And so our light is going to hit the photosystem. There's also light coming in from this angle, hitting the photosystem here. So that light is going to be the input of energy for the light-dependent reactions. Now the light is going to do two things. The first thing that the light does is it is going to excite an electron from this chlorophyll molecule. And when I say excite the electron, I mean it's going to actually literally bump it up to a higher energy level. So that electron is going to be displaced, and then the electron Notice that this is the electron transport chain. It is going to be passed from one molecule to the next all the way through this electron transport chain until it ends up down here. Now remember, this is another molecule of chlorophyll. Light is also hitting this photosystem, so its electron also gets excited. So the electron from the first photosystem is being transferred through the electron transport chain and is replacing this electron that is being excited in the other photosystem. So that was the first thing that light does. But remember, we said light does two things. It's not only exciting electrons, but light also is going to split water. So water, which is H2O, when it becomes split apart into its separate components, those components would be 2 hydrogen ions, 2 electrons, and an oxygen. Now this oxygen is going to leave as a waste product. Remember, oxygen is produced as waste in photosynthesis, so that is not going to be used in our reaction. But these electrons from the splitting of water are going to be used as replacement electrons for these electrons that get excited from chlorophyll in this photosystem. So we have an incoming steady stream of electrons to replace these electrons as they get excited in the photosystem. Now the other component, these hydrogen ions, they are also going to be used. So the hydrogen ions are going to be floating around outside of the thylakoid. So that means there's going to be a source of hydrogen ions for this electron transport chain to do its other job. Now, job number one of the electron transport chain is to transport electrons. But it also, as it's transporting electrons, is going to be able to pump hydrogen ions into the interior of the thylakoid. So as long as we have a steady movement of electrons in the electron transport chain, it will continually pump hydrogen ions into the inner part of this thylakoid, where they are going to build up in a high concentration. Now, this may sound familiar to you if you remember when we discussed ATP synthase. When you have a high concentration of hydrogen ions, those hydrogen ions move through ATP synthase, and when they do that, they are going to power ATP synthase to produce ATP. So what does that look like? Remember, in order to make ATP, you start out with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and then you need an inorganic phosphate group. And as hydrogen ions move through ATP synthase, it spins this bottom portion, and the ADP and the inorganic phosphate get built up into molecules of ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. So now we have the production of ATP. Remember, this is an energy storing molecule. So you typically see it with that starburst around it, meaning that it is storing potential energy. So up to this point, we have discussed the electron transport chain, how it has pumped hydrogen ions, and how it's transferred electrons. But at the very end, notice that we have these electrons now just hanging out in midair. Well, they aren't going to stay there by themselves. They need to be carried away. And so the way they're carried away is through an electron carrier called NADP, and that has a positive charge. This electron carrier is able to pick up 2 electrons and a hydrogen ion, because with 2 electrons, it would then have a negative charge. So it picks up a hydrogen ion. Remember, there's plenty of hydrogen ions from the splitting of water. And that's going to turn it into NADPH. Now this is free to go to the next stage of photosynthesis, carrying with it electrons that are used to build sugars in the light-independent reactions. So again, this process is powered by light. That's why it's called light-dependent reactions. And you'll notice that what we have done and why this process is important is we have actually used it to convert light energy, right? We're starting with energy in the form of light. And what do we get in the end? We're converting that light energy to stored chemical energy. And that chemical energy is in the form of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. So there you have the light-dependent reactions, which are the first stage of photosynthesis.